We are live. How are you, Sean?
Great. How are you today, Tiff?
I'm good. I was just saying I was running a bit behind this morning. I It's gorgeous here, so I went for a walk to get coffee this morning and was just kind of sauntering back rather than walking properly because it's so nice out.
Yes. Yeah. Got to
No.
soak up the sun, right? Yeah.
I know. It's supposed to rain the next like 7 days here, so I was like, I gotta take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Here too. Not looking forward to that,
No.
but glad to do another one of these live videos. They're always fun.
I know. I'm excited to be connecting with you today. And this specific live today, we're connecting on all around headless architecture and specifically how to really think about it in a way that benefits not only developers but also to marketers. And this is something that when I first was really joining Stack, but I learned so much about from you and just reading everything I could get my hands on because it is a really big problem for many teams finding that balance of uh, using a platform or tool that meets both teams' requirements from the marketers and developer side of things that they're not settling on. It's something that really works well for both of them.
For sure. For sure. It's also it's been it's been an interesting discovery period for me going back even 7 years or so. In the sense that this is a largely a developer-led movement. And
Mhm.
so at first it was, and I think to some extent today, how to get less technical folks, usually marketers a little less technical, and how do you get them to care about something that is generally a developer problem or a developer-led movement?
And sometimes it's one of those things where you almost start caring when it's not too late. I don't want to say too late, but when systems have already been in place, and then you're, as a marketer, maybe you're starting to utilize that system or that tool, and you're like, wait, this is not functional for me. This is not optimal. Versus getting involved at the beginning of the process, really.
Exactly, exactly. And I think you said it already, but the finding that balance between the two, how do we build something? Not how do we build something, but just that. Okay, it's if it's a developer-led movement, it's obviously good for developers. Yeah, why should marketers care? But also, how do you take something that is largely influenced and to benefit developers, and also um, provide some sort of benefit to marketers as well?
Exactly. How, and another question is that I have for you even before, well, actually, let me hold off on that question here. I'm going to share my working doc with you. And for context for those watching, I am going to be doing a talk covering this topic in June here. I actually have to have the talk ready though mid-May, so it's wild how quickly that is coming. Um,
Yep.
and the talk itself is a maximum of 10 minutes. So I'm really, which sounds, at first I was like, oh, 10 minutes, this is great. It's not very long. That will be easy. Then I realized very quickly, the shorter the talk amount of time, the more difficult it is to really dive into this subject, and it actually has become more challenging on because of that, which is really interesting.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, how do you provide just the right amount of background and get to the point quickly? Because as we found, even with these episodes,
Yeah.
we want to do it in 15 minutes, and it's so easy to just keep going.
Exactly. And there's so much to uncover, and you need a bit of a backstory before you dive into it. So let me share my screen here. Actually, there's going to be well, I think I can do my specific tab so there's not a million of us here. You can see my working doc?
Yes.
All right, let me zoom in here. Before we get into I'll give you a bit of, I'll share with you how this doc is structured before we dive into it. So the 3 bold points here are questions that I'm hoping to answer. But before we dive into it, let me just kind of read to you what my talk is going to be about on a high level. So it's to ensure that both developers and marketers benefit from a headless architecture. It's important to define a CMS that allows marketers to easily manage content and optimize customer experiences without impacting the backend development process. So, to achieve this balance, there are several best practices to consider when designing a CMS or thinking about this headless architecture, or when designing a CMS for headless architecture. Now, this could be reworded as I'm reading it out loud. It's one of those things I always go, oh, this might not be perfect, but hopefully, at least for this call, it gets across the point of what I'm trying to achieve. And then for the bolded parts, this is what I was thinking how to structure it. And not necessarily in this talk or this call, we need to go deep into the structure, but just for your context, I was thinking about starting with a bit of history on why this shift occurred to headless architecture, thinking about monolithic systems, thinking about why we gravitated towards this even in the first place. Like what was the reason? I always like to understand a bit of the history behind it. Then next is the challenges teams currently face, teams meaning marketers and developers. And then I would like to go into what are some ways to think about how to structure and define a CMS that meets both of these needs of developers and marketers.
Great. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think your structure is good. It's generally right in line with how I talk about it, setting up the
Mhm.
history, and yeah, and then I think these things work really well when you lead with challenges and with offering some solutions, and you can do that in a nice kind of tidy package within 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, the other okay, that's good to hear. The other interesting thing is even as we're talking about it today, teams are coming from all different backgrounds of where they are at with their systems. So, as you know, some might just be thinking about a new product they're working on and how they want to structure their architecture versus a team that already has a system in place and they either want to migrate or shift a little bit. And what does that look like? So it's interesting because every situation is so unique that speaking about it on a broad level is interesting to do as well, that it's beneficial to everyone listening, if that makes sense.
Right, right. Yeah, everyone kind of has their own spot in the history and their own journey and the tools they're using, but I think um you'll if you I think if you tell this in the right way,
Mhm.
you can catch folks in different parts of the journey and give them something, meaningful to take away. I think that the interesting thing about this story, and this is a story I've been telling for a while, but I think what's interesting about it is that it's hinting that we're not at the end. I mean, I think that obviously you're setting this up so that StackBit is one of these answers, to
Mhm.
this question. And honestly, that's a lot of what attracted me to StackBit a couple of years ago, because I think that StackBit is among very few in the space, kind of ahead of its time in trying to solve this problem. And I think it's a really important problem to solve. And so, yes, I mean, this is setting up the kind of the core StackBit story for sure. But I think that the story is really compelling because it can tap into folks almost anywhere along this journey, unless they've answered that last question, which I think very few people have. Um, you can you catch somebody who hasn't even considered headless yet,
Mhm.
or someone who has started a migration but hasn't found the right tooling to stitch together, or even someone who's fully in the headless world but maybe not optimized in some space. And so that's kind of why I like
Yeah.
the story really it really speaks to me.
I like that. That's such a good point. Really like your point, or yeah, your point around why this is such a, I forget how you phrased it, but basically why this is such a popular topic and a large or interesting topic to cover is because maybe we still aren't at the solution fully yet. I think you said something around those lines.
I think so, or at least most most organizations are not, is maybe the way that I would say it. And I mean, not that an organization has really ever has everything figured out, where we can always do better. Um, but I think that this story is interesting to me because the process to move to headless is it's a large one. It takes a long time, and it's a total shift in a way of working, and often various pieces come together over time. And so I think that this particular topic is really relevant to most people in this space, because even as you're moving into the headless world, it's there are always things to refine. There are likely always missing pieces, missing tools that can be stitched together to make this more comprehensive system, or just to like operate or optimize how it all fits together.
Mhm.
And again, when that sort of thing, deciding your architecture and the tools you're going to use, a lot of times historically and still today, these decisions are made by technical folks and technical leadership, and depending on the organization, may or may not be made in a silo without consideration of the folks who are using it. And it's not to say that the people making those decisions to bring those tools in are doing the wrong thing or making the wrong decision. It's yet another consideration to make, and not one that we've really historically had to do. um it's we've seen, I think, a lot of times, marketing teams or other business units will see some sort of tool, present your IT or your engineering groups with that tool and the desire to bring it in, and then bring all sorts of different teams to the to evaluate it and decide if it's the right tool or not. And so I think, kind of talking around that space, that this topic is really interesting because it's a really, oh, what's the word is, it's kind of a really empathetic way to approach
Mhm.
headless architecture. That as developers, the underlying architecture is our responsibility and our team's responsibility, because we have to maintain it and we have to work with it. But there are also users internally, and if we're going to do the best job we can do, then we need to consider our users and also what's best for our users, and not just what's convenient for us.
I love that. That's really well put. And then too, at the end of the day, it's more times than not, it's actually not that convenient for us in the long term, considering if the people who are using it are struggling or finding it challenging, then oftentimes it's kind of that full circle moment where then they're coming back to the developer to with questions or to make the changes as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Right. If you don't put the right system
Mhm.
in place, I'm thinking about how to phrase this, that it can take more effort. Um, yeah, it's kind of like, what's the old proverb about giving someone a fish versus teaching them how to fish? You give them a fish, they get to eat for a day. You teach them how to fish, then they eat for a lifetime. I think it goes something like that.
Mhm.
And so with uh, choosing tooling that we're going to use within an organization, we can think about that same sort of approach. There are ways to buy software and ways to develop software and internal tools that can band-aid a problem or that can strictly follow engineering conveniences. And one of the negative results of doing that, whether it's to be convenient, to move fast because there's a ton of pressure on you, whatever it might be,
Mhm.
that that thing ultimately might take you more time because for your other internal teams to work with that product, you're going to have to be involved or you're going to have to be fixing bugs or whatever it might be over the whole lifespan of your organization. Using this thing or building this thing may take more time, usually does take more time, more energy, more money than it does to start from a place where you are engaged with the folks who are going to use that thing and either building or buying to some level of satisfaction for those folks. And with a motivation, I like to say it's still kind of a it's still kind of a motivation of laziness of is we developers are lazy, right? Developers are inherently lazy. I think I can say that as a developer. um, and the cutting corners approach is kind of a lazy approach, but also you can kind of like switch. Yeah, you can kind of switch that. What do I say? You like you can kind of switch how you apply the laziness as a weird sort of example and say, I want to be lazy, and the way I want to be lazy is I don't want to hold your hand after I give you this thing. So I'm going to take the time now and I'm going to invest my energy and my time and my money in this project so that the thing I give you is exactly what you want and it lets you operate on your own. I'll still have to spend some time on it, certainly, but I'm not going to have to hold your hand anymore. I might have to fix some bugs. I might have to add some features. Totally fine. And what exactly those things are depend on, did you buy it? Did you build it? What is it? But over time, your involvement goes down, or you spend a lot of time up here at the beginning, ship the thing, and then your involvement goes down and stays really low, and you can work on other high value projects over time. Or you get this thing out the door and you might kind of like ebb and flow how much energy you are spending on this thing over time, but you have this much smaller window of time and energy and money probably that you can spend on higher value things over time. And the idea in most organizations is to spend your time on the highest value thing at all times. So get the thing that is valuable, build it, get it out there, and then free up the time so that you can move on to the next valuable thing, which is probably changing pretty rapidly in most organizations.
That's really good advice. And it's kind of going back to what you were saying about developers being inherently lazy and typically trying to do things the fastest way or the easiest way. Not always. I'm not we're blanket statement here, but that kind of thing. It brings up a question I have for you around, and I know this can vary company to company, but based on everything you just said, does it make sense typically for when these decisions are being made? We keep on mentioning that marketers are not typically involved in that stage. Does it make sense to bring in marketers, or can that slow down the process by having more cooks in the kitchen kind of thing?
Definitely can slow it down, but I think I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's
Mhm.
having the right people involved in the process is probably what you should strive for. So certainly having more people involved just to have more people involved, not the answer necessarily, but having the right stakeholders involved in the process, absolutely. And I think there there are different ways and approaches to buy and build software, and most of the time, a decision to make a move like that is going to be prompted from solving some sort of problem. So recognizing that there's some sort of problem or challenge internally, and then solving that thing. Now, where that a problem originates could be a number of different areas. And so if there is some problem that is originating in marketing, then it's already probably more likely that that team is going to be involved in the purchasing process. If I go back, 10, 12 years ago or so, I was working for a bigger organization. It was a construction management company, and we were moving all of our, I should say, let me start at the problem. We recognized that we had a problem because we were managing this large number of digital assets in marketing for the entire organization, and they were all basically on this one file server. So you had to be in the building or VPNing, and it was just really inconvenient to get to this thing. But it was, you had to know where the files were within this massive system. And so you had to basically go in somebody else's brain to figure out how to go find the image that you wanted. And this is around the time that digital asset management systems are kind of exploding, around 2010 or so. And so we recognized the need for that sort of thing. And because the tool was largely to serve us, we went to the IT group and gave them some options. They helped us evaluate for price, security, long-term value, et cetera. And we eventually picked one. But in that case, it's kind of, at that time, this was going to be a tool that marketing was primarily going to use. And we kind of just needed to get other internal stakeholders to sign off on it if they were going to have some hand in the thing over the life of it. With what we're largely talking about in this conference talk here is more with web technologies and generally public facing websites. And because of that, they are tools that both marketing and engineering are very heavily involved in. And the choice you make has a major impact on both of those teams. And so I think, kind of coming back to your question, so I think to answer the actual question was to say having the right people in the room. And I think the answer to that is anybody who is going to use the thing. So whatever it might be, whoever's job it affects over the life that your organization is going to interact with it, those are the people that ideally are involved in the beginning to some capacity and have some influence on it, because there's a huge risk that you go down some path, make a decision, keep some other person who should have been a stakeholder out of the loop, and then they come up with some red flag in that process of purchasing it that makes it seem like actually that was probably a bad idea. So yes, always having the right people in the room early on is the way to go.
The right people in the room. I agree. And I like you mentioned too, essentially people who are going, the right people are the people who are using this tool. Sometimes I think that it sounds pretty obvious in that situation, but more times than not, especially when you get to dealing with a large organization, it's not always the people who are going to be using it in the room, but it's more so about, I guess, the decision makers in the room, which might not always be the people using it. So that's kind of an interesting balance to navigate too.
Yeah, and generally in well-structured organizations, or when the decision makers are are responsible, that they are going to lean on the folks they're going to lean on the folks in their area of the organization to give them some advice on the thing. I don't think that in most cases, large software purchases, that the person who signs off on it is just signing off on it or doing a ton of research in the thing. I think usually they are often, first of all, often they aren't actually the ones instigating it. It's
Mhm.
someone has brought the request to purchase this thing to them, and usually they're going to ask lots of questions to have to,
Yeah.
so that the person who brought it to them has to justify that decision and all of that. So yeah, I think that kind of trickles down to the point where, okay, so an individual developer is not going to technically have a say in ultimately purchasing this massive piece of software.
Mhm.
But I think if on the right teams with the right people and the right structure, some developer at some point is probably going to get a chance to look and evaluate the thing and pass major red flags kind of up the hierarchy so that you can influence the decision in some way.
And even to further that, it's probably not always, but probably you mentioned that a lot of times these decisions come out of a problem that was discovered. And usually that problem is put forth by an individual developer or marketer or whomever that is facing this problem to begin with.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's something you could get into here, which I think would be really interesting
Mhm.
is, again, like you said, there's so many different threads that you could follow, and
Wow.
how you focus on people and where they are in their journey. Um, I'm because I guess that's something that you have to decide here too, is you're giving a brief history with your first point
Mhm.
on the shift to headless. So you're not the point of your talk isn't to convince somebody to shift to headless, right? Because you're basically just saying this has happened. In fact, theoretically, because that's not the point you're trying to make, you could maybe even omit that entire first section and
Good
just
point.
say, hey, we're going to make this assumption that we're operating in the headless world. And that,
Yeah.
that could be a result of who do you expect to be in the room,
Mhm.
focus of the conference and all of that. But anyways, um, if somebody is already in this headless architecture space,
Mhm.
then then yeah, I really like the idea of thinking about, okay, well, what are I'm trying to think of, maybe a good way to kind of plan out which direction you go is to think about what are the various challenges that people are running into, and those challenges can be affected by, do they, since we're talking about marketers, we're largely talking about content management systems,
Mhm.
probably.
Mhm.
Do they already have one? Where did they come from? What is their history? What would make the ideal why don't they have their ideal situation? And then same thing from the developer's perspective. Why wouldn't they have their ideal situation? And how do you kind of fall in the middle? I don't think that was super coherent, but I'm just kind of like,
I
point being, identify those challenges, right?
I like that, and the why don't they have their ideal situation really hit home to me because it's almost working backwards in a way, as to uncover what the challenges are that they face, whether it be they're already using a headless CMS or they're considering it, but why are they not there? Or if they are using one, why are they still facing these? Like uncovering the why, it sounds like.
I think so. And okay, when I tell this story, I'm keeping in mind that you only have 10 minutes. So
Mhm.
you don't have a ton of time to set background, and maybe some of that can be implied. But there's kind of a layer of nuance in the story if you consider whether or not somebody came from pre-headless. Did somebody actually come from the monolithic world, or did they get dropped right into the headless world?
Mm,
Because I think if you have there are problems with headless inherently, just, base just challenges, not problems. There are challenges with effectively executing headless architecture, and I know that's part of the point you're proving here. I think the question I'm asking is, or what I'm trying to uncover is, if you there's kind of like an additional. Mm, okay, here it is. I know what I'm trying to say. If you have somebody who you just dropped into headless space,
Mhm.
hey, I graduated from university in 2017. My organization had already shifted. I'm in marketing. All right, I don't have any history of that monolithic world. There are still issues I have with the way I work. Or you take someone who's been in the industry 10 years longer than them, and they will experience definitely some of the same challenges and some of the same friction points, but they have this additional level of experience where, depending on the tooling and the way they've moved throughout their journey, there were some things that they had back in the monolithic years that they don't have anymore. And so that new person doesn't have the context of those things. I'll give you a quick example. Um, let's pick one. Okay, how about scheduled publishing is one. So nowadays, many of the more popular headless CMSs do have scheduled publishing built in. For many years, in the early years of this shift to Jamstack and headless architecture, that was a really it just didn't exist. It didn't even exist in some of the biggest content management systems. Like Contentful has been huge for a long time, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I don't think that scheduled publishing is all that new to that platform. And there are tons and tons of other CMSs where it's just not really a thing, because it's actually a pretty complicated problem to solve, especially if you have any pre-rendering baked into your site, because you have to decide what you're going to do. And I was building many websites in these early headless years. And so with this problem, if we were going to have any content pre-rendered and the content management system didn't offer scheduled publishing, then we would have to wire all these really, really complicated tools together to figure out how exactly when to publish. And if we had different sites at some organization that were relying on the same content sources, we'd have to figure out how to do it, where we could do it in parallel to shorten the publishing time, and where we had to do it in series. Otherwise, we'd run into some race condition where we'd publish something that was linked to something else that didn't exist. And it can get super, super complicated. And so that's a sort of scenario where, if you're just coming into headless, you probably are thinking something like, well, that seems like that's a feature that should probably exist, but I don't have any knowledge of that not existing. So it's annoying, but maybe it doesn't hurt that bad. Okay, eventually we'll get there. Versus the person who has been in the monolithic world, well, when every page request hits the database, or when it's a little bit easier to manage cache invalidation and figure out when to actually hit that database, you're like, every request is hitting the server in some way. All you really have to do is you just have to have a publish date in the database, and then you know whether or not to show the thing. And it's like the engineering and the programming was so trivial to execute on that sort of thing, and so complicated to do it in the headless world. And now content management systems like Contentful are handling that, which is great. But that's an example where, if you're using this persona of someone who came from that previous world, they're like, well, this isn't just inconvenient. This is terrible. This is a huge downgrade. Why don't I have this thing that is a basic feature of content management systems that have been around for 20 years or so? And so that's where I think how much of the history you tap into, that's what you'll have to play with. Maybe the history actually isn't how you start, but you can kind of like filter it in as you go through the various challenges.
I like that. I really like the idea of kind of filtering or threading it in throughout the challenges. And also, too, one thing that stands out to me as you are sharing these stories and examples, they feel really close to home when you're specifically sharing these examples, and I think that is something I'm definitely going to take into this talk as well, is giving specific examples. Even when you were sharing about the challenges you faced working at a different company a few years back and whatnot, and I can visually see all that happening, if that makes sense. Like, you're really taking the listener on a journey with you and really hitting home on the problem versus just talking about the sorry, let me scratch out problem and say challenge, versus just talking about the challenge, but actually taking the listener on a journey with you. So I'm definitely going to do that as well.
Yeah, but I think we could spend some time to outline what those things were
Mm.
and elaborate a bit on some of that nuance because I think that there were it's really hard. You're like, how do I make this compelling
You know.
but kind of stay out of the nuance? So it's almost like, all right, let's go back to the history thing for a minute. You could basically say there's this monolithic era
Hmm.
and you've got that thing that you can always compare to. And then there's this period of time where there's the Jamstack movement and this movement toward decoupled architectures where most of the services that people were using were really immature. And so the underlying infrastructure was there, but to get some of the basic features that we had in the monolithic world, we had to do a lot of work as engineers, and it was really complicated work comparing it to the monolithic years. And now we're kind of in this third era where the tooling around decoupled architectures is beginning to mature a bit. And so some of those base level features are starting to be just packaged with different tools and different services that we might use. And scheduled publishing is one of those things. Um, uh, One that is there thanks to StackBit and very few other folks is previewing. Previewing draft content was fairly trivial in the monolithic years. Now, it wasn't a great experience, but it was possible. And then it was like take 100 steps backwards because the immediate movement to headless was previewing what like scheduled publishing so hard to execute in any level of effectiveness, and virtually no content management system was no one was doing it really. um there were a few that had some really kind of creative approaches to it. And now, even in this third era, this is where I feel like there's a really compelling story for StackBit because there's StackBit and there's a few of our competitors, but it's still mostly like if you just go with the Contentful and your front end framework. Contentful is great. It's great at managing and storing data. You don't have that preview layer, and which is why we see a lot of folks pairing StackBit with with Contentful. And StackBit does much more than previewing, but it's that's one point. And so
Yeah.
maybe I don't know. I guess it's at least worth exploring how you go right into the challenges, and if you do that, how much nuance do you put in there in
Hmm.
terms of recognizing like um, where we are in the journey. Do we actually, maybe you don't even want to recognize that middle ground of we had moved to headless, but a lot of those problems that were really hard from 2015 to 2020 don't exist as much because the leading tools have solved them.
Hmm.
I don't know.
It is interesting. I really like how, and maybe I do have to remove that middle ground for sake of time, but the full story about how you broke it down from, it's kind of I don't know why I just thought of this, but it's like, um, the first era, the second era, the third era. This is a terrible example, but I'll just finish my thought actually. But it reminded me, when Web3 and blockchain was all the hype, right? This is a terrible example, but it was like Web 1, Web 2, and now Web 3, kind of like I don't know what it would be called, but CMS 1, CMS 2, CMS 3, and just seeing how the evolution of that.
Yes, sort of, but it was almost like the approach or the underlying architecture from headless in 2015 and headless in 2023 hasn't really changed. I mean,
Good point.
the approach and the core benefits for the most part are the same. One that isn't, that is really interesting to me and off topic totally, is cost. It's like when we were selling this in the early days, we
Mhm.
were one of the things we were saying is this is so much cheaper. I can cut development costs in half. I can cut your service costs in half. And for small websites, that is actually it's fairly accurate. It's fairly accurate. For enterprise sites, no, they might actually even be more expensive because um, there are more tools to take advantage of. Now, the, that's there's nuance to get in there because like the services might be more expensive, but they might also save you needing to pay humans. So,
Yeah.
anyways, um, my point was the underlying architecture was the same. I think what I was trying to say was that when you get to that phase 2 or that second era, we've shifted into we've started shifting into decoupled architecture, but it's the very beginning of this movement. And so for a lot of us working in it at that time, it was a huge step back because
Mm.
we could feel the underlying benefits that the foundation of this thing
Mhm.
is so great. It simplifies DevOps, it commoditizes all the really hard parts of managing websites. It as a result of that, or not even a result, it was just it was almost like okay, I'm trying to say this a bunch of different ways to see how it resonates the most, but it was almost like it was like a eureka moment because these tools come together, and I give Netlify a ton of credit for bringing this, like bringing what I called the, like the final infrastructure piece, commoditizing the deployment of the Jamstack approach. And it was such a compelling idea
Mhm.
that it led to this massive movement and people moved so quickly here. So it wasn't even where the organic growth is kind of happening at the enterprise level, but from an individual developer and smaller teams and that sort of thing, they people just jumped at this because the core benefits were obvious and amazing, game like totally game changing.
Mhm.
And so we moved really fast, and so fast that we were like, yes, I want to bring this everywhere. I want to jump into this thing all in. The shop I was working at that time, we were doing everything in Ruby on Rails one day. We did one project, and the next day we were like, done. We're done with Rails. We are all in on this Jamstack, this decoupled approach. It moved so fast that at that time, there just wasn't enough. There weren't enough tooling. There wasn't enough tooling. There weren't enough developers having worked on this, building websites with this approach for years and years. And so some of these things that should be really simple, um, they didn't exist and they were really hard.
Mhm.
So we solved them. And it took 5 years for the most part to solve them. So now we're kind of a couple of years past this. It's still kind of second era, but it's the mature version of the second era. And so we talked about somebody who just gets dropped into some situation. Well, if you take someone and just drop them into the situation today, if they're using the right tooling, they don't they probably don't recognize that scheduled publishing was ever even a problem in this decoupled world. So that's another approach you could take, is to just say, hey, we're going to operate at status quo. Like, what are still the challenges today? And maybe you just ignore those things that were problems in that goofy kind of immature phase two era.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's a good point. It's resonating now because I'm someone who I'm the character who you mentioned who you kind of drop in at this point and uh, doesn't necessarily recognize or understand the pain points that going back to scheduled publishing, for example. You know, if it was one of those things where you only know the tools that you know or are familiar with, and you weren't as used to it um, in the past, then you don't know what you don't know. I guess you could say.
Exactly. Exactly. And and I mean, you're speaking to people in the present, so maybe, yeah, maybe it's probably not valuable to get hung up on things that were painful that might not be as much today, and
Focus
that
on.
might even, yeah, right. It might even help you target, or not target, prove, tell a compelling story in 10 minutes because you'll get less distracted that way, having to fill in all this historic nuance.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pain points I can talk about that are happening today, or challenges that are happening today, as we know. So it's definitely um, endless on that end as well.
For sure, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's just, it's a question of whether you are, well, it's back to what we talked about at the beginning. Are you going to pinpoint a team that has already adopted headless, or somebody who's doing it but has challenges today?
I need to narrow in on that because as we discovered through this call or spoke about through this call, that can speaking about either of those can be a bit different. But also too, they'll resonate with there's a lot of similarities that they can resonate, just different points in that journey.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking it it's probably more compelling to assume that somebody has adopted it and think
Mhm.
about what are the challenges teams are most likely to face after
Yeah.
moving to headless,
Mhm.
because you could, um I I think, because even if somebody hasn't moved, and considering that this is a conference talk, if somebody hasn't migrated their stack yet, if they're going to come to this talk, then
Mhm.
they're at least interested or know enough that there's some benefit to doing it. So starting off right away with the challenges of folks who have migrated already might cut out a lot of that noise, nuance, background that
Mhm.
doesn't hit toward the point, and then you've got a couple more minutes that you can spend emphasizing the point at the end.
I like that. I think that's what I need to do because, like you said, if they're coming to this talk, it's for a reason. So rather than trying to, please everyone and in turn please no one, meaning just stick so high level to touch on everything, kind of hone in on folks who have already made that switch to a headless CMS and the challenges that they face.
Exactly. Yep.
Like
I
that.
think that I think that could be interesting. At least
Mhm.
trying it from an outline perspective and seeing if it feels good.
Yeah. Okay. I like this has been such a valuable workshop or working lesson for me anyway. So
Something. Yeah. For sure, for sure. As you know, I love talking about this. So, yes, yes, and it's also kind of giving me ideas of this learning in public thing. I think is really interesting, and maybe there's a way to kind of play on, just instead of learning about something a little more randomly,
Mhm.
we talk about, whatever we're doing this week. Like, what problem are we trying to solve? And it might change our audience a little bit, but I don't know. I'm going to think on that topic.
I like that. I think it's something to definitely Yeah, let's touch base on that. And then anyone who is tuning into this now or afterwards, leave your thoughts on that below as well. And I'll also link down below some uh I feel like I say this in every live, but I'll link down below some of Sean's blog posts related to this because Sean, as I'm sure everyone who's watched or tuned into this has uncovered, you have gone deep in these subjects and are very knowledgeable, and I love picking your brain about it. So, for anyone who wants to read more of different posts that you've written, I'll link them down below.
Great, great. Yes, comes from a lot of pain and frustration, but but I still love exploring it.
All right, Sean, I'll see you next week. Thanks for everything.
All right, bye, Tiff.
Bye.